children of the poor. They need a way out of urban slums and rural poverty. Americans count on schools to give these children a chance. Critics charge that schools are failing to provide equal education for the poor. They say schools aren't doing enough. But children of the poor can't wait. While national controversy rages, they are growing up. Now the federal government has published a massive study challenging widely held beliefs on educating the poor. It's called the Coleman Report. The Coleman Report takes a new look at school integration. It discusses social class as well as race. The Coleman Report examines the roots of education. It questions how much schools really influence student learning. The Coleman Report doesn't make light reading. Its official title is ponderous, Equality of Educational Opportunity. It's a 700-page document filled with technical tables, charts, and statistics. The two-year study involved more than 600,000 students and 60,000 teachers in some 4,000 schools. It was conducted by the United States Office of Education under the direction of James Coleman, a Johns Hopkins University professor. Authorized by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Coleman Report was expected to document what everyone knew, that poor achievement among Negroes and other minority groups was the result of inferior schools. But the report went further. Despite the Coleman Report's controversial findings, most people outside the world of education never heard of it. The report has had little impact since it was quietly released during the last year's July 4th weekend. Nevertheless, the Coleman Report could create vast changes in public policies and public attitudes affecting schools. The Coleman data already has been used as a basis for the United States Commission on Civil Rights report on racial isolation in public schools. Since last fall, more than 50 professors have met at Harvard University for a microscopic analysis of the report. The Coleman seminars were conducted by Daniel P. Moynihan, former Assistant Secretary of Labor, author of a controversial report on Negro families, and now director of the Harvard-MIT Joint Center for Urban Studies, and Thomas Pettigrew, Harvard Associate Professor of Social Psychology and Chief Consultant to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. During this program, we're going to take a hard look at the Coleman Report and its implications for American education. Well, gentlemen, I'm sure you'd agree that one of the most important issues raised by the Coleman Report is the issue of quality of education versus integration. Many people feel that good teachers, modern school facilities, and relevant courses will do more for a deprived child than integration. Before we get into this issue, let's see what two community leaders said when asked the question, which is more important in education, quality or integration?
It's always been my feeling that quality is more important than integration. I can't see any hard evidence that proves a real deprivation because of a person's color. I think that every school system has the charge to first discover the talent of the child and then develop it to its maximum potential. It has always been my feeling that regardless of your race or color, the individual differences of a child are the things that we should direct our attention to. It has always been my opinion that if the schools can provide the best possible education, that they are then discharging their primary objective.
It is my opinion that they're not separable, really. But if you're asking me if I have a choice, whether I would have, talk about, as I say, I can't separate them, and if somehow or another you could, I would say you'd have to start with integration in order to bring about quality. Now why? Because we know in America that anything that becomes all Negro is considered inferior by the total white population. We see that time and time again. If we don't stay on top of an issue such as schools, we'll see the fact that the Negro child, less is being spent on the Negro child than the white child in a per capita basis. And little by little, we slip into this area of neglect. So in order to have true quality education for the Negro, you're going to have integration. And I know there are a lot of people who argue that you can train Negro children just as well in all Negro settings you can in all white settings. This may be true, but I don't think it'll ever be possible. It may be true theoretically that Negroes can learn as well in all Negro settings, but I don't think the possibility of this occurring is ever going to be a fact because, as I say, this whole idea of the fact that Negroes are in fact inferior to whites in most white minds. And I'm not saying that this is a whole massive attitude of bigotry on the part of every white citizen. What I'm saying is we have been brought up in a culture that allows for this breaking down of the value structure on the basis of ethnic origin.
Well, gentlemen, whose opinion do you agree with?
I would agree with Mr. Parks when he says he really doesn't want to separate the terms integration and quality. I think, in fact, that really makes the question misleading. Quality means integration, not just for Negro American children, but for white American children, too. One thing I think we have learned from the Coleman Report, and hopefully from the studies which will be inspired by the Coleman Report, and that is that the usual way of thinking of quality as teacher-pupil ratio, as fine, say, physics labs, etc., books, libraries, is not just the only way of thinking of quality, but that in point of fact we have to think of the children that make up a school. We have to think in terms of integration. Now, Mr. Orenberger says he knows of no hard evidence that you need integration for quality. I'm not sure there is any hard evidence about major questions in education, but to the extent that we have hard evidence, I think the reanalysis of the Coleman data provide that evidence, and I wish Mr. Orenberger would look a little harder for it.
Well, have the schools really been providing equal educational opportunity up to now, either quality education without integration or with it?
What do you mean by equal educational opportunity? This is a very first point, and one we haven't gotten very close to thinking about. Do you mean everybody turns out to be just as smart as anyone else, just as well educated, or along kind of a distribution that God gave us in the way of brains, that kind of thinking? What do you mean? Or do you mean that each group turns out with the same distribution of ability within it? These are ideas that are much less examined than you might think. It seems to me that Coleman found three things, and probably we should begin with what he found. He found first that there is a very great difference between the educational achievement of different ethnic racial groups in America, and that the white majority, so-called, does very much better in the end than do Negroes, Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, Indian Americans, any other group excepting Oriental Americans who do very well indeed for themselves. That's point one. The second thing he found was that the quality of schools, in terms that they are normally measured, namely how much money do you spend on this, how many master's degrees do you have in your teachers and so on, within different regions did not vary as much as we thought. Right, Tom? Yes. It varies, and the poorest kids get the worst, sort of, but not anything like the measure we imagined. The third thing he found was that this thing called quality of the school didn't have as much influence on the achievement of the children as we thought. It pretty small, and it's there in the first grade as well in the 12th grade, and it's not anything like as simple as we thought. What he did find was that the biggest thing that goes into a school building are the children, not the teachers and not the physics labs and not the library, but the children. And that when children go in who are doing well, everyone around them does well. Children teach each other. They turn out to be the great teachers, something like that. After that, we have to ask ourselves, well, when we say equality of educational opportunity, it means something more than how much money you spend in the schools. It means do children going to them, by and large, have a chance to mix with those children who, by and large, set educational standards? Tom, is that about right or wrong?
Yeah, I would say that that was perhaps the most important single finding of the Coleman Report as far as educational policy is concerned. What can schools give to disadvantaged kids? I think the Coleman Report, as you're saying, Pat, is that they can provide them contact with advantaged children. And that contact with advantaged children is perhaps the most, well, it appears from the Coleman data, rather clearly the most important thing schools can provide.
Well, now, there are some people like Floyd McKissick, who is National Director of CORE, and other Black Power self-help advocates in the Negro community, who contest that you can have quality education without having an integrated school. Is this true?
Well, you would never want to say that it would never be true under any circumstances. In many ways, Mr. Parks, I think, has already said it for us. That is, in the best of all worlds, of course, an all-Negro American school could be as good as an all-white American school. But this isn't the best of all worlds. This is America of 1967. Somehow the Black Power people, I must say, I'm sympathetic with their feeling. Their feelings involve dignity, and you're trying to tell them, well, Negro children will not achieve unless they're in school with white children, and there is some indignity involved in that kind of claim. But if I'm sympathetic with their feelings, I'm not sympathetic with their inconsistency, because it is Mr. McKissick himself and others of Black Power persuasion who say this is a racist society. Now, America is many things. It is, in part, a racist society. It's also an idealistic society. It's many things. But granted that it is a racist society, it seems to me, to some extent, it seems to me the Coleman data show that it is. As Pat's just said, the enormous differences between ethnic achievement in our schools, clear indication of the racist and the consequences of racism. Now, on the one hand, the Black Power people say it's a racist society. On the other hand, they damn the Coleman Report for showing the consequences of the fact that they're right.
Well, if the Coleman Report shows that the deprived child, the Negro child, will benefit from integrated education, what effect does integrated education have on the white child in terms of the Coleman data?
Just one point first.
Sure.
And Tom's a Southerner, so he's always thinking about Southern problems. I'm a New Yorker. I think about some New Yorker problems. And I think one thing Coleman did, after all these years, is he united us in some understandings, which is that we think of problems of class easily in terms of race. What Coleman came along and showed us very clearly, Tom, is that race is just one word for the class status of a certain number of people. But the Negroes are not the only poor people in this country. They're not the only working class people in this country. There are many others, white, as we say, or Puerto Rican, or Mexican American, or whatever. And for these persons, the segregation into neighborhoods, which don't look segregated, but in terms of class, are just as segregated, has just as harmful effect on those children. It holds them back just as much as it holds back a poor Negro child. And the great thing Coleman has to say to us is that it's not race that defines educational achievement for the greatest part. It's class. And that the white community in this country has got into the habit of thinking that there's no such thing, for example, there's no difference, for example, between Somerville and Newton. Well, I think Coleman has news for them. There's a big difference, and so much the worse for the kids in Somerville.
Well, is there any great benefit to whites in integration, or is the benefit always to the
Well,
low
Tom
class?
Pettigrew has carried out what you might call the second-generation analysis of this data, and found a very clear finding, and it's part of the racial isolation in the public schools report. Tom,
You're making me feel old, second generation. The fact is, yes, there are things that white children very much benefit from in predominantly white schools with Negroes, as opposed to all white schools. And that is, they learn to live with Americans who are not white. Their attitudes toward Negroes are really remarkably different and much more tolerant and accepting. Tolerant is a weak word. Much more accepting on a very natural friendship basis if they have in fact been educated with Negroes.
Well, do you feel that we're going to really have integrated education in our era? Do you think that we can really integrate by class as well as by race? Mr. Moynihan?
Well, if we do, it's going to be, it's saying that we're going to do something we haven't done, because we've got, our schools are class segregated, and that includes race segregated, but that's just part of it. And if we change that, it's going to mean a big social change in this country, and it's going to mean setting out to do things we haven't done before, and probably mean we're going to be a better country. But whether that's going to happen right now, right quick, I don't know. What do you think, Tom?
Well, I think we have here the seeds of the reason why the report was so quietly issued by the federal government, why it has received so very little attention. The fact of the matter is the findings and their implications, as Pat is pointing out, are really quite politically inexpedient at this point. We've been talking about a war on poverty. In point of fact, what our war on poverty strategy has been is to do something for disadvantaged people, which means give them something where they are, but it has not meant bringing them together with advantaged Americans. And I believe the Coleman Report, even beyond education, at least strongly suggests that the usual techniques, certainly not all of them, but the usual techniques we've employed so far in the war on poverty are very likely to have very few, if any, effects, simply because we have avoided bringing disadvantaged Americans in contact with affluent Americans.
Well, while the battle over integrated education goes on, it's becoming clearer and clearer that the schools are becoming a major target for social protest. Educators often say that they've been asked to take an unfair amount of abuse, and their critics say that the educator's just trying to get the schools off the hook. What about schools' responsibility to overcome discrimination? Here's what two other community spokesmen responded when we asked, do schools have a major responsibility to eliminate the effects of discrimination?
The schools have a shared responsibility, not a total responsibility. In fact, the primary responsibility of public schools is to educate each child to his fullest potentialities. But unfortunately, there are some who ask the schools to assume a myriad of responsibilities which really should be assumed by the church and community. The schools have been asked to do too much. The solution rests with the entire community.
Yes, I do believe that the public schools have a major responsibility to overcome the effects of discrimination. I believe it sincerely because they are the vehicle through which the children are most in contact with during the day. I feel that they would have the best facility in bringing about change in a subtle way. I think it could be done without attention being focused directly on the lesson that was being taught. I believe that even though the school system has a shared responsibility in overcoming this effect, I don't believe that our particular system has done enough toward it. There are two trends of thought or thinking in our particular community. The one that says that there should be an integrated educational system, and the other that says that there should be quality education within the community. I believe that the school system has a basic responsibility to attempt to channel either parent groups into the situation or condition that they prefer. But as far as I'm concerned, most public school systems have not done enough to overcome the effects of racial discrimination.
Mr. Moynihan?
Well, I think it's useful to note that Mrs. Hicks said that she felt schools did not have a total responsibility. Mrs. Jackson said that they had a shared responsibility. These are two ways of saying the same thing. And the question that I believe the Coleman study raises, and the one which probably should interest us, is not how to argue out which word we prefer, but to ask what can schools do?
Well, is Mrs. Hicks right? Have the schools been asked to do too much?
I think it's what Coleman probably says to you is that there may be a limit to what schools can do, both perhaps an absolute limit and certainly a limit if you have very special groups of children in different schools, and they aren't a general mixture representing kind of what the country itself represents. The point that Jim Coleman's study keeps coming back to is that what comes out of the schools is largely what goes into them as pupils in the present state of American education. And the Tom Pettigrew's study of racial isolation in the public schools says, for example, that many of the compensatory education programs that we've tried to work to help poor kids in poor neighborhoods haven't worked. Well, a lot of people jump on this and say, you say they can't work. Other people say, why did you say that? It's because you don't want them to work, isn't that it? Well, that's not what either Pettigrew or Coleman have said. They simply said that what's going on now doesn't seem to have much effect. Doesn't mean that a different concept entirely couldn't have a totally different effect. It doesn't say you can't change things through schools. It doesn't say you don't change things through schools. It simply says that schools seem, by and large, to have rather the same effect on people, and the efforts to make special effects right now don't seem to be very successful. Doesn't say anything at all about what the future could be like.
Well, how much power do schools really have to affect change in the area of discrimination?
All we seem to know right now is that so long as poor children are kept apart and in schools by themselves, those schools don't seem to have any very great power to change them. It doesn't say anything at all about what would happen if we had a different kind of school, and it certainly does say that when those poor children are mixed with better off children, they do very well indeed.
Well,
now, Tom, what do you think?
Well, I think the two things are relevant here. I would agree with Pat's interpretation of the Coleman Report on this point. I think those who, I'm happy to see Ms. Hicks, by the way, believes that the whole community should be doing something about the race relations problem, since she has not provided her own community with the leadership that would suggest that she'd believed that in the past. But the point is, she's quite right. It needs all the agencies of a community to do something about this deep problem. And what we've had in the past is sort of each realm pointing to the other. The schools say it's not our fault, it's the fault of housing. And housing says, well, don't look at us, the real estate people, it's really the fault of employment. They don't have enough money to live. Employment says, well, they don't come educated enough for us to hire them at the best job. Each pointing to the other. Now, clearly you have to break that cycle somewhere. The schools are an obvious institution to put special emphasis on, though not exclusive emphasis, because they form the institution which in fact makes the difference for children. It is the major social intervention in the lives of children. And I might point out that many educators who refuse this role, I think, are denying the greatness of their own institution. Remember, the great contribution of American society for democratic theory in the world is the contribution of the idea of public education. And time after time, we've called on our unique institution of public schools to handle problems, often problems which by no means could the schools be blamed for. For instance, who taught English and assimilated over 20 million immigrants to this country? The public schools were the major institution. Who handles the problem of poor driving when we have a lot of accidents on the road? The schools, though they could hardly be are asked to give driver training.
So that it's valid for parents to storm the gates and to make demands on the schools that would solve a lot of the problems, let's say, of the deprived home.
Time after time we have, in fact, asked the institution of public schools to do something about our most serious social problems, and time after time the institution has, in fact, responded, and responded well. To say that it cannot, should not respond this time, I think, is to deny its great history.
What do you think, Mr. Moynihan?
Well, I think this is exactly so, but there are two things to add to what we know and what we expect. First is if you want schools to do a lot of things, it's an easy idea to say the reason this particular school isn't doing this particular thing is that it's not as good a school. Well, if that isn't the case, then you're not being very honest and not being very helpful by going around yelling that it is the case. You know, Tom. And what I think Coleman has suggested to us is that the schools on balance are not so different in terms of the effort goes into them. Now, there are differences, but they aren't as big as we seem to have thought. You remember Mencken said that romance is the illusion that one woman is different from another. Well, we have those ideas maybe about our schools, and maybe they're not it's not that relevant. I mean, one woman is different from another, and yet one woman is like another, and that's the kind of thing. Now, the second thing is this, that we are finding that when we started public schools in this country, we started them because we wanted to overcome the inequalities that come from birth and inheritance of property and inheritance of social class. That's why we started them. The people who had money, had position, were getting educated in this country in 1830 and 40, like they always had been. But the people, the workers, weren't. And the working class parties in Jacksonian America, in New York City, for example, and other places, began demanding public schools. And by and large, it's been our great success. Yet we are finding that when we shouldn't suggest that because we've had a success at running a democracy that we've got a lot of equality in this country, because we haven't. And the kids that go to the best private schools still get into the best colleges. And take, you know, everybody's got an ethnic group. Tom's a Southerner, which is our biggest ethnic group in America, right, Tom?
And a noisy one to boot.
That's right. I'm an Irish Catholic. We're not as noisy as we used to be. But one of the problems that has always troubled Irish Catholics, Roman Catholics in America, is that we have had private schools, our Catholic schools, as long as there have been public schools. They started from the same reasons, and they split off in the early 19th century. And the development of American Catholic students has been pretty slow. Not been anything like we would have hoped it might have been. It's coming and gone very well now, but it took a long time. And I wonder, for example, if Coleman doesn't give us a clue about this. When you take very poor kids, which the Catholic kids of the 1830s were in this country, and put them all together, see, and you bring those wonderful nuns in, and they break their hearts and give their lives, and the poor parents build decent buildings and all that, but the progress is very slow. I wonder if Coleman doesn't suggest to us that you bring poor kids together with other poor kids, and the Catholic schools were sort of segregated for a long time. They may still be in some places. They are not. They were racially segregated and everything like that, but they were segregated by poor children with poor children for a long time. Maybe that explains how slow the upward rise was.
Uphill climb, doing it that way.
So that schools really do have a responsibility to do something about discrimination, but that it's going to be a slow process and a very involving one.
Well, if the community gives you segregated schools, which are segregated by race or class or religion, and those groups which are at the bottom of the pecking order, because it's class that makes the difference. We hate that word. I hate that word, but it makes a difference, you see. If the community segregates children by class, then it has a hard time asking the schools to overcome the consequences of class. And those consequences are real, and if you don't think it, walk down any city street in America and you'll find it out fast.
Well, another Coleman Report issue seems to be the question of the effect of schools on student achievement, whether or not up-to-date schools with lower class sizes, for example, have really much impact on the deprived student. A teacher and a suburban housewife had different answers to the question when we asked them, does spending a lot of money on school facilities or lowering class size greatly improve student achievement?
Well, I would not say a lot of money. I would say necessary money, which would run into a lot of money if we had to give the children which they so justly deserve, as far as new schools, library facilities, cafeteria facilities, new books, and library teachers who train the children from the first grade right through to use books for research and whatever they need to know. As far as lowering class size is concerned, it has been proven that if classes are a small size, the teacher has much more contact with the individual child and is able to help him in any problem he has. People sometimes disagree and say that it is the parent's responsibility, but it is the school's responsibility to take every child from the place where he is and take him further.
No, I don't think spending money per se or lowering the teacher ratio is going to significantly affect the children we want to reach. A child has to be motivated to learn. He has to come to school ready to learn. If he's in a classroom with 50 children and he's not actively participating or even passively listening, he's not going to learn anything. And also, if he's in a classroom with 25 children and he's not listening and not participating, he's still not going to learn anything. Now, you take people who have come from the slums, poor homes, but have been very successful in later life. Almost invariably, they've had a mama or papa who says, work hard, study hard, learn your lessons. You're going to be a doctor, maybe even president. And that's what we need, more of this type of mama. And that mama isn't here today. In the lower income homes, mama doesn't get the kind of support she needs for herself so that she can be a mama. And since our society values money, it puts a money value on almost everything we do. It's not worth anything unless we pay somebody. I suggest we pay mama, say $3 an hour, so that she has the time and the resources to be the kind of mama the child needs.
Well, Mrs. Gaser has an interesting position there. I think this whole question, actually, of what the Coleman Report found on school facilities and its correlation with achievement is perhaps the most misunderstood finding of the report. It is often interpreted to mean that school facilities make no difference whatsoever, almost as if you didn't even need 4 walls for the classroom or something. Of course, many educators understandably are upset by this interpretation because they can only imagine what it'll be like when they try to go for their next bond issue and have conservatives tell them that you don't need any money for school facilities. They don't count anyway, says the Coleman Report. The Coleman Report did not find that. What the Coleman Report could test, Pat's already alluded to this, is only what exists. It could not test what does not yet exist. Therefore, take its most interesting finding, that pupil-teacher ratio was certainly one of the most believed-in dogma of all educators, I believe, myself included, did not correlate in any significant way whatsoever with achievement scores. Now, this does not mean that a class of 500 is not different from teaching a class of 5. Obviously it is, or we think obviously it is, but Coleman didn't test that. He could only test the class sizes that do exist, in fact, in American schools. And the range you find in American schools goes from about 20 to 40. What he shows is that between 20 and 40, more or less, does not make a difference in achievement scores. Now, there's a difference, presumably, below 20 someplace and above 40 someplace, which the Coleman Report could not test because such classrooms do not often exist in public schools. So it's not that facilities make no difference whatsoever. It's that the relatively small range in facilities in American schools today, as Pat has already mentioned, do not make a difference. Now, this means, of course, if we start thinking of schools of a type like we do not have anywhere yet today in America, there's every reason to believe that such great schools could, in fact, have pronounced
Are you talking
effects.
about the large campus school, for example?
I'm talking of campus parks, educational parks, and so forth. And let me just point out that they might have their effect even though facilities themselves still were not having the direct effect. That is, Coleman has shown, as Pat has emphasized this evening, that the important thing is the middle-class milieu of the student body. Now, how do you get a middle-class milieu? Obviously, you need the middle-class kids. Now, how do you get them? Well, you've got to have things that attract middle-class parents to send their children to those schools. So if you have Olympic pools and classes which teach the lute It may not correlate with achievement scores directly, but it's pretty important to have, I think, because we have to start thinking of middle-class children as a resource, and we have to keep them and attract them into the public schools.
Well, Mrs. Gaysor raised the point of children's motivation. She talked about the need to motivate children to want to learn. What does the Coleman Report say about children's motivation?
Well, I think that first I'd like to say that I'm for the Gaysor plan of paying housewives $3 an hour. Now your housewife, your dear wife is a doctor. My dear wife is a housewife, and I think that's a good plan.
You're bucking for that $3.
On the whole question of attracting middle-class children, as we say, whatever that means. Remember, if you're in England, for example, if you want to get really sort of middle-class kids to come to school, what you say is that our school buildings are 400 years old, and they have no plumbing. And then you can double your fee, they'll pay to come, they'll do anything to get in. So
status may be the key word.
It's complicated, all right? But second, you asked about the issue of interest in learning. Now, Coleman comes through with, if nothing else is to be learned from this study, and lots to be learned, it is that American children believe in the power of education. And they've only been taught maybe to think of education as schools, but that's not their fault. But they think that if you study, if you work, if you try, it'll be good for you. We don't have any problem with telling them and persuading people what they ought to do. What we have a great problem with is enabling them to do it. Somehow, for the poorer kids, and this is kind of a pathetic thing comes through. They think they're really doing well. They want to do well.
They want to be president and doctors.
They want to score well, yeah, and they're not. They're not, and that's not funny at all. And that's no way to raise a kid. I think you'd be better off telling them who they were at the outset rather than letting them think they're somebody they end up finding out in a pretty hard way they're not.
Doesn't that sort of squelch them?
Of course it does. It breaks their heart. How in the devil can you go through life thinking I'm in the top half of my class, I'm doing very well, I'm probably going to go to college, and then find out at the 12th grade, if you get there, that you're really at the 9th grade, if that. Now listen, get this straight. Coleman studies demonstrate one thing, and nobody will question this, that the educational achievement of the poor kids in this country is terrible. And to tell them they have an equal opportunity in life when they are unequally equipped is to just to break their heart. It's to make them losers in a game that's already rigged against them. I mean, no one told them that it's not that clear to a child, maybe, when he gets out of school, that he goes into competitions where he's going to lose. Yeah. And we say it's fair, but then you make a kid a loser. Why get him in that game in the beginning if you're going to put him out this way? And I think this is, remember, the median achievement, the median, half above, half below, for 12th grade Negro children in mathematics in this country is 6th grade. Right, Tom? 6th grade, huh? Now just take where those fellas when they come out, those girls too. Now, it seems to me when you see what's really happening, and then you read in the paper that parents are raising the devil, demanding to control this and do that, who's going to say to parents of children like that if you go into that school and take it over, you're going to spoil the education of your children? Those children are coming out of the 12th grade, those who are still in, with a 6th grade mathematics achievement.
Well, why is that? Whose fault is it?
We don't. That's that's what Coleman says. It's a combination of impacting poor kids with poor kids, low-achieving kids with low-achieving kids. They can't do anything for each other.
And the teachers don't want...
Teachers try. It's not fair. That's the old talk of teachers. It must be somebody else's fault. It's society's fault, if it's anyone, of putting those kids together. Now, look, we haven't known this before. It hasn't been so clear. Looking for people to blame is looking for an excuse. What we should look for is solutions. And Coleman helps us, doesn't he, Tom?
And that there's a structural problem here rather than chasing devils that are causing, let me say, of course, there are many critics of the Coleman Report who point out this error and that error. The report is just a survey, and it was done hurriedly, and there are indeed mistakes, as our seminar has found. But this finding comes through, no matter how you manage to control the other relevant variables, no matter what errors we have found do not in fact affect the importance of social class of the student body. And may I also say that previous studies in sociology of education prior to the Coleman Report found the same thing, and people didn't take them very seriously because they were not based on anything like this sample of 600,000 children throughout the United States. But in other words, we have a great deal that makes us confident of this finding and its important political implications.
Well, what kind of effect does, let's say, a child's sense of awareness of his situation, his sense of destiny, have in relation to his achievement in school?
An interesting racial difference here comes out, which Pat has alluded to in part already. There are two attitudes that Coleman tested very well. One was, how bright do you think you are in class? You were referring to that in a way, Pat. The other is what you might call fate control. How can you determine your own fate in this world? Every time I start to get ahead, something gets in my way. Good luck is better than hard work for getting ahead, etc. Now, for white children, the attitude that correlated very highly with achievement scores was how bright they thought they were, not how much. They assumed they could control things, their environment. For Negro children, what was important was how much they thought they could control the environment. How bright they thought they were, as Pat's indicated, was almost irrelevant for predicting their achievement. Now, the interesting thing is, those Negro children with the strongest sense of fate control, without this feeling that they're just corks in an ocean, unable to do anything about their fate, these children with this sense of control were much more likely to be found in interracial schools.
Well, anyone who's spent much time in the ghetto schools soon comes to find that poor kids seem to have more social, economic, and psychological problems than youngsters who come from better backgrounds. We talked before about the political power of the school. What about the power of the school, its ability to affect what happens to children from disadvantaged homes? Is it too much to ask schools to do something about this? Here's what a school administrator and a civic leader told us when asked, do you believe schools can overcome the problems of children from lower class homes?
Yes, I do, at least to a much greater degree than we have ever tried. The capacity exists, the intrinsic structure is there, whereby schools can be utilized. In fact, the institution of universal education is ideal for trying out many new ideas which haven't been tried at all. But I do believe that if we would think a little differently, even with the structure that now exists, that we could involve the community so much more in the operation of the schools, in the planning of schools, in the policy making of schools, and that this in turn would have a very real effect upon the homes, which of course in turn would have an effect upon the children. But I'm thoroughly convinced that there is a capacity within the schools and within the school structure, even as it exists today with modifications, to make a real difference in the lives of people who have been socioeconomically deprived.
That's a very comprehensive question and can't be answered briefly. Let me say, however, that good schools can go a long way in compensating for disadvantaged homes, but they cannot perform 100% of the task. Our experience in compensatory programs with lower pupil-teacher ratios, additional personnel, and services has shown great progress. When we keep in mind, however, that the pupil spends 5 hours of the day in school and the other 19 hours of the day under the influence of the home, we realize really how little time the schools have to overcome poorer homes and environments. The school has the child for only 1/10 of the year, while the other 9/10 is spent under the influence of the home. We have seen the beneficial effects when a child is enrolled in after-school and summer school programs. A longer school day and a longer school year, in addition to beginning school at an earlier age, should help greatly. I feel that the family unit, under whose influence the child now spends almost 90% of his time, is the real key here. All agencies, not the schools alone, must work together to improve family unity, stability, and environment.
Mr. Kennedy, I think, has said it well, but we have to put what he has said, I believe, in perspective. Mr. Kennedy runs compensatory programs in all Negro schools. The Commission on Civil Rights reanalysis of the Coleman Report would suggest that this was the hard way to do it. And I'm not surprised that Mr. Kennedy is not too sure that his programs can make it all by themselves. Of course, he needs community support. But the idea that compensatory education in ghetto schools or just for disadvantaged children, regardless of race, alone can do the job, I think is really false. And I believe that the special analysis done by the Commission following up the Coleman Report show that this is really too easy. It's expensive, but it's too easy a way to try to help the problem. The fact of the matter is these schools are stigmatized. Often when you begin a compensatory program, you act merely to further stigmatize the school. Now, this is not to say that compensatory education is not necessary and is not helpful. It is both necessary and helpful, but it has to occur in interracial schools. That is, to really try to have compensatory education to make up for the problems of ghetto education and so forth is a little like bailing water out of the boat without fixing the leak. The leak, segregation, has to be fixed also.
But even in a larger, more integrated school, if you're going to group kids according to their abilities in the classroom, couldn't you have resegregation even in a highly integrated school?
Of course you do. And I'm not much in favor of ability grouping. You know, there's virtually no evidence to show that ability grouping helps children. It helps teachers. It is easier to teach a class, and I can understand teachers being human, like the rest of us, why they might like that. But there's no evidence to show that that's very beneficial for children.
Mr. Moynihan?
Well, this is the thing we keep coming up against, which is that if you want to help children who are behind the rest of their age group, you gotta mix them with their age group. And it happens that certain levels of social class, which is mostly levels of how much money do you make, how much money do you have, how much money did your daddy give you. Some people get a lot, some get none in this country. Well, those who get none, so much the worse for them. And if we want our public schools to do, and our Catholic schools and our Protestant and Jewish schools, I mean, I think we all have, this country has a general idea that schools are going to not just replicate the social structure in this country, but to do something to allow every generation to have kind of a fresh start, kind of a new race to start all the time. Not that everyone's going to end up the same. We're going to have winners and losers. That's the world. We don't want a different world. We accept those terms. But if we want to give all those new people something like a fair chance, then we have got to give them a chance to mix with one another. I just think this is what keeps coming out of Coleman. And I think that we have probably got to be pretty clear about what we mean by equality of opportunity. That's a word we like to use, and it's a very popular word, you see. But if what it means is we are going to let everybody take the same examinations at age 21, and we will judge them by how they pass, what their score is, say. And yet it's clear that everybody from this end of town is going to fail, and everybody from that end of town is going to pass. Well, is that equality of opportunity? I mean, why talk about such things if that's what's going to happen? And I think that in order to deal with this, we've got to reintroduce to our thinking some idea of group and class, and saying it's just not going to be good enough if all the Lithuanians in town get rich and all the Estonians in town stay poor. I mean, it's just not, you don't have equal opportunity somehow if that's your result.
So the schools really can't overcome anything until we get this class integration.
That seems to be what we now know. Now, but I think that's, as Tom Pettigrew has made very clear, that's just what Coleman reads from the present system. And the only way he reads that is, and as we, in our seminar at Harvard University this last year, we've reanalyzed and gone further into these data, these numbers, and we find that children from lower class families who are in school with children from middle class families invariably do better, and wow, do they do better. I mean, race has an effect, but it's a small effect in comparison with class. Isn't that right, Tom?
Yes.
I mean, you know, middle-class Negro children in schools with lower-class Negro children do very poorly. In schools with middle-class Negro or white children, they do very well. I mean, you know, this thing keeps coming through. Now, all we know is that the present schools, children in those situations perform better than children in situations where they're all tied together in lower-class groups. Now, doesn't say we don't know. We haven't begun to invent new kinds of schools that might do much better. Coleman himself, for instance, has this to say. He says that I think we've begun to measure the results of schools by the results, not by what goes in, by what comes out. All right, why not let businesses, private enterprises, get involved here and pay them by their results? Say, I'm going to give you 50 children who can do third grade mathematics. I'll pay $100 for everyone who ends up with fourth grade mathematics.
So don't we get rid of the public school system that way by providing competition?
Well, subleasing or subcontract, I don't think the schools could still be in the business. It's a little hard to figure out the details, but I think Pat's example just shows the kind of thinking that you at least start allowing yourself to tinker with, given these findings. I think our discussion so far should have raised in the minds of the viewers two major problems we really haven't touched at all, Pat. One is what happens to the advantaged kids from being in school with disadvantaged kids? Are they hurt by this as the disadvantaged kids are improved? And the second is how would you bring it about just in practical terms, even admitted that it was desirable? Well, on the first one, in our reanalysis, both in the faculty seminar at Harvard and the Commission on Civil Rights reanalysis of the Coleman data, show rather clearly that as long as it is, for race, as long as it is a predominantly white school, whites do as well academically as they do in all white schools. For advantaged, as long as it's a predominantly advantaged school, they do as well with disadvantaged children as in an all advantaged school. In other words, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not that each school has a finite pie of educational goodness and that if somehow the slice for the disadvantaged children or Negro children is a little larger, there'll be less to go around for advantaged children. It doesn't work that way. Schools are stretchable in how much educational goodness they have, and not finite slices will hurt them.
Tom, would you let me ask you one question now? And this is a thing that comes through, and I don't think we're settled on it. Certainly our seminar didn't settle anything. Professors get together to disagree and raise questions, not to answer them.
We had a good time, though.
We had a good time.
Yeah.
Thanks to the Carnegie Corporation, I think we should say. But there is one thing that did kind of come through, and that is an awful lot of suburban housewives have been blamed for running out to the suburbs to get their children into good schools and made to think maybe they're sort of monsters of prejudice or whatnot. I think we have to say that Coleman found that that behavior was sensible behavior. Up to, given the desire to have your kid do well, you probably achieved that desire. And you were behaving in a rational way, maybe. So that if you asked people to change that behavior, you had to give them rational reasons to behave otherwise, such as, for example, your Olympic pool, such as your majority advantage. and plus extras.
So we've got to really sell integration to the whites, is what you're talking about.
Well, you see, integration, as I think Pat has pointed out, is a narrower part of the problem. It's much broader if you start also thinking in class terms as well as in race terms. And I think, though, as Pat has said, we don't have exactly the model of the school that we can point to right now. I think we now know what the dimensions are we're looking for.
Let me ask you this. How do you really get quality class integration in a city which is broken up with, let's say, various ethnic and class ghettos?
Well, I think your question really leads into the answer. That is, clearly, you have to have metropolitan cooperation. It doesn't mean necessarily a big, large metropolitan school district, but metropolitan cooperation. We just can't do it alone in the central city. It's not just a matter of money. It's a matter of human resources and a lot of other things.
But is this politically realistic, do you expect?
I think it will be if the federal government will start giving educational grants for consortia of suburbs in the central city rather than just to single grants. I think the suburbs would like to help, providing they can do it on terms which they know are not going to hurt their children in any way, and you could.
Well, in the time we have left, I'd like to ask you about the directions and the implications for the Coleman Report. What effect do you see it having in the next year or two?
Well, I hope it shows one thing, and that is that Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, was not only a great piece of legislation, but a very necessary one. And it shows that the poor kids in poor neighborhoods in this country need help. And the question maybe help them most effectively, but the fact they need help comes through clear.
Well, I'd like to amend that just a little. Title I of the now $1.5 billion a year we're spending on Title I for disadvantaged children of the Elementary Secondary Education Act. I think it was a great step forward, but the wrong formula. That is, it was based on the compensatory idea of doing it in the completely disadvantaged school. Now I'd like to have a little amendment to it. Maybe not the first session of the 90th Congress, but maybe the second session or the 91st Congress, whereby we have some money for middle-class kids to participate in these Title I programs.
But you agree that we know that those kids need help.
Oh, yes, and now we have the precedent
we used to
for doing
think
something.
maybe we now know.
Yeah, that's true.
Thank you, Mr. Moynihan, Mr. Pettigrew. For the last hour, we've been examining the controversial Coleman Report on equal education for children. If the analysis presented here tonight is correct, the Coleman Report could lead to major changes in educational policy. If schools contain children from the same kinds of backgrounds generally, and class integration is vital, then the Coleman Report could lead to the death of the neighborhood school concept. If family background may have more impact on student achievement than school facilities, more money may have to be poured into families through subsidies, the negative income tax, or other methods. To many, the Coleman Report raises more questions than it answers. It seems to have something from everyone's point of view. In the years ahead, the Coleman Report will be analyzed and reanalyzed, probed and dissected. It will lead to more studies, but it will not go away. The big question is, how long can children that will provide equal educational opportunity and more?